Hello, everyone. My name is Luke Belleni. I know some of you, but by no means all of you. I'm the Director of Standards and Partnerships here at the Copper Mark, and I am joined on the call today with my colleague Hilary Amster, who I suspect most, if not all of you know. She will be talking specifically around on the slides that we have around assurance and also on the new requirements around tailings, but is also there as a kind of resource as our in-house assurance expert and long-standing staff member of the Coppermark who has uh, probably will be able to answer some questions that you may have, particularly the assurance-related ones, better than I can. So thank you, Hilary, for joining. We have a mixture of people on the call today. Um, we have people from participating companies and also a large number of people from assurance companies, assessors, as we call them. And so we will be perhaps a little bit more assessor focused in this webinar than we might otherwise be. But hopefully, whatever your background, you will get good use out of this webinar. And with that, I think we should start. Hopefully you can all see my screen. If you can't, please do shout. And we will get going. So we're here to talk about the Risk Readiness Assessment version 3.0. This is the latest version of the RRA, which came out on the 19th of October. It was almost a 2-year process to revise the standard from the previous RRA 2.0. And to be honest, it's a relief to get it out there. It's been quite a long process. As it says here, the guide is in 5 languages. We have added extra languages from 2.0, and we hope that helps participants to be able to read it more easily in their own language. So what is RRA 3.0? So it's a 33 criteria as opposed to previous 32. It's not simply a case of we just added one. We have added some, we have subtracted others, we have merged others together. And we have grouped them under the environmental, social, and governance kind of pillars. And the criteria guide, which is what generally we at the Coppermark refer to as the RRA, where I think technically the RRA are the criteria in themselves, but for us, the criteria guide is kind of the more important document and obviously encompasses the criteria. That guide is meant to be guidance for users and for stakeholders, that outlines, as it says here, ESG management systems and due diligence practices. This guide has been around since 2017. It was first introduced, first created by the Responsible Minerals Initiative, and then was revised for the first time in 2019, and then again in this current revision that we've just gone through. That's why we're calling it 3.0. And the revision was conducted both by RMI and ourselves, the Coppermark. And as it says here, also, we now have over 80 users of the Coppermark specific users of the RRA. So it's growing almost on a daily basis, perhaps a bit of an exaggeration, certainly on a monthly basis. And we're very happy to see that growth. What were the objectives of this revision? So first off, perhaps most importantly, was this what you see here is credibility. So ISIL guided that process. They have very specific requirements around revision processes of sustainability standards. And essentially, there's no point in putting in all the time and effort of revising a standard of the size of the RRA if once you've done so, it's not considered to be credible. So that's something that we put a lot of focus on to ensure that we had a broad range of inputs. We had a lot of public consultations, two major public consultations. We reached out to a lot of stakeholders individually, um, and we made sure that we, at the very least, covered established norms, and in many cases went far beyond. Auditability, as my colleague at RMI and I were going through the revision process, after every change, we stopped and said to ourselves, is this an auditable requirement? And how might a site provide evidence of that? That was very important to us, and obviously important to many of you on this call as assurance providers. Um, One of the big changes, I think, that from 2.0 to 3.0 is this one about comparability. Um, I think that 2.0 was very much a mining focused standard. And while I think probably 3.0 still has a bias towards the mining side, we've tried very hard to make sure that it applies along the value chain, um, and we ensured that we got input from actors all along that value chain to ensure that they felt it was suitable for their purposes. We also put a lot of effort into making sure that it was aligned with relevant regulatory frameworks. The big ones we will talk about later on in this presentation. Clarity, we try to ensure that it is absolutely crystal clear what is a requirement, what it is that sites are actually required to do in order to receive the copper mark or the nickel, zinc, or molybdenum mark. And that's hopefully come across in both the wording but also the structure. And then lastly, responsiveness. So we want to make sure that we are not immediately behind the curve as we look across the different voluntary sustainability standards that are already out there. I should have said at the very beginning, I've put 2 hours in people's calendars for this webinar. I don't expect it to last that long, but I wanted to make sure that there was lots of time for questions. And also, what I absolutely don't expect is that I will be talking for 2 hours straight. So please stop me at any time, either by raising your hand or taking yourself off mute and simply speaking up. And I'm very happy to be interrupted. And if you have any questions or you want further clarification on any point, that's very much uh, expected and I think will be helpful for everybody. I think otherwise you will very quickly get bored of my voice. So next steps for Copper Mark participants. So while the RRA 3.0 came out on October the 19th, was launched on October the 19th, it does not become effective until the 1st of January next year. From that point, all new Copper Mark participants, i.e. participants that have yet to send in their letter of commitment by that time, must use the new RRA 3.0. Any Copper Mark participant that is being reassessed in 2024 can choose between the RRA 2.0 or 3.0. As it says here, we will strongly be encouraging them to use the new one. We believe that the new one obviously is kind of improved. However, we thought it was unfair to require a site that's going to be reassessed in 2024 to implement RRA 3.0 because they would have had very little time to prepare, given that it only became public in October. And so we've left that optionality in there. And then 1st of January 2025, all participants, new and old, will be required to implement the new RRA. Just to say that from next year, well, actually, that's not true. We've already started. Hillary was in Chile a couple of weeks ago and provided some in-person roadshow presentations to a number of our Chilean participants on RA 3.0. Many of the same slides that you will see today, she presented there. But really, the main roadshow will kind of get going next year, where we will be offering an in-person. We, the Coppermark, will be offering an in-person presentation to each Coppermark implementing site around the world. And as it says here, the main goal that we have set ourselves for 2024 as the Coppermark team is to ensure that that all participants feel properly supported as they transition to RA 3.0. And we recognize that in many cases, there's been some big changes and some changes that will not be easy to implement. And so we very much are here for our participants, and also for many of you, the assessors, as we go through this process together of transitioning to 3.0. So with that, I will pass it over to Hillary to take us through some of these assurance slides.
Great, thanks so much, Luke. And hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. Excuse me. We will take a look at some of this assurance and also just make sure to send out the slides so you can spend a little bit more time on each of the examples. But to get us started, we can go to the next slide. To say that we do have a revised assurance process. We are on version 5. It's available in English, Spanish, and Chinese, and it also comes into effect in January 1st of 2024. The idea is to align it with the revised RRA. Next slide. And you'll see some of the major changes that we've implemented. I promise they're not too overwhelming here, but probably most importantly, and what we'll spend some time on today, is the adoption of the revised performance determinations. So this is where we say fully meets, partially meets, does not meet, and not applicable. And that has been updated to align with the revised RRA. We've also included a standardized reporting template. This is something that we hope to really start to pilot with everybody. We recognize it's not a final version, and that likely will need to have a bit of an iterative process on this. So we welcome your feedback as we begin to use that standardized reporting template. We've included in this version an Annex 2 that talks about how we manage allegations in the assessment process. So this is what we're doing when we find any allegations first in our initial due diligence before we work with a participant, and also if anything comes up throughout the process once they are already a participant. We then have just some smaller updates, including the title of the joint due diligence standard and a clarification that our assurance the process applies regardless of the outcome. So whether you're applying for the molybdenum mark, the nickel mark, the zinc mark, or the copper mark. And then finally, we've included some other documents that we had already developed, but they were standalone into this assurance process, like the extensions procedure. Next slide. And if I could just ask everybody to mute their lines, just because we are recording, we want to avoid as much background noise as possible. So if you're not already on mute, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Great. So we did spend quite a bit of time working through the performance determinations and what this will really mean in practice. And for this, we worked with our participants as well as assessors, our technical working group, and of course, our advisory council. What we've determined is really the definitions for the does not meet and the fully meets. Those are the sort of black and white, and have a another category of the partially meets, which is where everything that doesn't fall into those neatly defined categories ultimately rests. So within our does not meet, we do have the requirement for a system that is in place and aligns with the core, or does not align. I'm sorry, let me start that again. For our does not meet, we do not have a system, there we go, that aligns with the core requirements of the criteria. Or there's a system, but it does not align with the core requirements. Or there's not demonstrable consistent implementation of the system. So either there's no system, the system doesn't align with the criteria, or the system is there, but it's not really implemented. So the biggest change here that you will see is something like a policy or a plan without any implemented system is no longer going to be considered a partially meets, but instead is a does not meet. And this is really to help ensure that when we are awarding a partially meets, a determination of partially meets to a different criteria, we're able to say that there is a system and it is in fact in place. In contrast, a fully meets determination is a system that is designed and aligns with all of the core requirements of the criteria, and it is consistently and effectively implemented. And we monitor and track that implementation and review the effectiveness of the management system and update it as appropriate. So you'll see here, there is an element of effectiveness that has been added into the fully meets to ensure not only that the system is there, but that it's doing what it is intended to be doing. And I think this is really important for everyone, both on the participant side and on the assessor side, to understand that that is really the big nuance, the big change there. And finally, as I mentioned, where things don't fit neatly into either one of these categories, they generally will fall into the partially meets category. Next slide, please. What does the partially meets in practice really mean? Because this is, of course, where there is going to be questions. The most gray zone is going to be in this partially meets. And so here's just a little bit more context here. First and foremost, as I've mentioned, this is really our catch-all for when there's not a does not meet or a fully meets, and it's somewhere in between. It's also used when there are practices in place, but the system is not fully implemented. So where there's a system, but the participant says something to the effect of training will take place, or this will be rolled out, or we will have a fatigue management plan. Those are the situations in which the criterion is partially meets. It's also applicable when not all of the core elements are met. So, for example, if there's no public reporting yet, our criteria, and we'll talk more about this, all have a public reporting element here. And so, if that is not complete, this then would fall into something like the partially meets. And then finally, as I've mentioned, one of the key components to the fully meets is this idea of effectiveness. So, where the effectiveness of the system hasn't been reviewed or verified and can't be corroborated through triangulation, those are situations as well where this would become a partially meets as opposed to a fully meets. Next slide. I do think it's important, just as always, to highlight a few considerations that we like to make sure everybody is aware of. One is the public reporting requirements are applicable where specified. And that's important to say what is required to be publicly reported and in what format. There are, of course, two criteria specific to public reporting as well, but you will see now within the criteria themselves that there's an element of, for each of those themes, of what needs to be reported and where. Within the different core requirements, there is, of course, some flexibility to have gaps within the sub-bullets to meet a partially meet, but not for a fully meets. So within each criteria, you will see a list of requirements. There's usually about 4 or 5. We'll talk a little bit more about that. If within one of those, there are some elements that haven't been fully met, right? This, or not at all started even, that could potentially be a partially meets. But it would not be sufficient for a fully meets. And then finally, and this is something that we've just learned over time, is participants should not be penalized on more than one criteria for the same issue. Though we do recommend that the relevant criteria should be referenced in the criterion where the gap is ultimately considered the most suitable. So as an example, if there was an issue with legal compliance related to environmental permits, that could potentially go in legal compliance or in management systems. And so the request here is to essentially pick the one that is most suited towards and reference it in the other, but basically not give a partially meets in both instances, or it does not meet, depending on the gap. Next slide. Great. So I do have here an example from each of the different buckets that we have. We have governance, social, and environment. And so I will very quickly try to go through some of these examples just to give you a sense again of where we are in a does not meet, a fully meets, and then for each some concrete examples of where you might see a partially meets. So when you look, for instance, at our criterion 6 on sustainability reporting, you would have a does not meet in the following instances. There's no system to identify material, environmental, social, governance issues, report on them at least annually, using internationally recognized reporting standards, and in accordance with the requirements for good reporting, and where applicable, in line with regulatory reporting. So again, there's no system to do any of this. There may be a system, but it either does not include identifying material ESG issues or results in an annual report or uses recognized reporting standards or meets the requirements for good reporting. Could also be a does not meet, right? So there is a system, but it doesn't align with the core requirements of the criterion. Or finally, it maybe it does not meet if there's a plan to meet the above, but there's no public report that meets those elements as of yet. In contrast, you would have a fully meet when there is a system to identify material ESG issues and that annual report, and it uses internationally recognized reporting standards in accordance with the requirement for good reporting and in line with regulatory reporting requirements. So you can see here, I've taken each of the core requirements of the criterion itself and broken them out to say this is a fully meets or it does not meet. It also must be done consistently, and it's regularly reviewed to ensure it's meeting the goal of enabling corporate transparency and accountability and promoting informed decision making. So that comes directly from the criterion itself. It'll say that's the intent. And then finally, if it doesn't meet that goal, there are plans in place to improve the sustainability reporting so that it does meet that goal. Next slide. So where would you see a partially meets in this case? And how would you actually differentiate between a fully meets or it does not meet? Well, one example here is that there is a report done annually in accordance with the requirements for good reporting and regulation, but it's not done using internationally recognized standards. For example, GRI and others require an external verification of that report. In that case, many of the elements would be there, but they haven't really met the full requirements for a fully meets. Another example is that they have everything in place in terms of the actual report, and it identifies the key ESG issues, material issues. It's been externally verified, but it's not being reviewed to ensure that it has the right elements to ensure corporate transparency and accountability and promote informed decision making. In that case, while it would meet most of the elements of the criterion itself, it's not meeting that one on a review for effectiveness. And then finally, another example is that it does have a review for effectiveness, but there haven't been any changes based on the outcome in the case where that review does demonstrate a need for change. right? So you can sort of see the evolution here of where we get from a fully meets back to a partially meets. Next slide. Great. An example here then on our social criteria is going to be our new criterion 11, which is child labor. And here, I will try not to go through in as much detail just for purposes of time. But basically, once again, here are situations in which you would have a does not meet. There's really nothing in place. There's no system and no commitment to prohibit child labor and hazardous work for workers under 18. Um, and that means that there's no process to identify and assess risks, communicate and assign responsible persons, an action plan to prevent and mitigate risks, implementation of the plan or remediate cases, and public disclosure. So those, again, are all those sub-requirements. There is a commitment and that process to identify risks, communicate, and an action plan, but it's not actually aligned with the requirements. So when you look at those sub-requirements and the expectations there, even though these are in place, they're not what the criterion itself calls for. Or if all of that exists, but it's not really implemented, or finally, if there are cases of child labor and they have not been remediated, those are cases where this would then be a does not meet. In contrast, you would have a fully meets when all of those elements are fully in place, they're demonstrably implemented consistently, it's regularly reviewed to ensure that it's being effectively implemented and it's effective in its end goal, which is, in this case, preventing child labor, hazardous work for workers under 18, and remedying cases where child labor or hazardous work are identified. And if the system is found to not meet that goal, there are plans in place to improve the system. Next slide. So what are some examples then of that gray area? How is that partially meets? Oh, I think this last sentence was intended to be removed, but that's all right. We'll leave it here for now. If the participant has all the processes in place to, for example, verify age, but records indicate that's not done for every worker. So they say, we're going to look at everybody's age to make sure that they are over 18. But when the assessors review records, they see that there's quite a few that are missing any age verification. Another example might be interviews with relevant personnel indicate they're not trained to, for example, verify that age of workers. So when assessors speak with human resources, they say they've never heard of that, or they're not able to speak to that process. That might be an indication that even though the systems are there, they're not fully implemented. They're only partially implemented. Cases of child labor are identified, and even though they're remedied, there are no changes to the system to prevent child labor, right? Cases of child labor would indicate that the system is not really working. And in that case, there would be a need for some change. And so if that hasn't happened, that would result in a partially meets. And finally, if there's no public disclosure related to child labor, that would be an instance in which we're now looking at a partially meets. All right, next slide. My last one here is just on waste management. Again, trying to give examples of each of the different areas that we're looking. And in this case, you'll see once again the same process. And one of the things we're going to talk about today when we look closely at the criteria is that they all follow this same format for how the criteria themselves are written out. And so you'll see once again in the does not meet, these elements of the criterion of the system itself are not in place, or they're in place, but they're not aligned with the requirements, or they're in place, but they haven't yet been implemented. In contrast with our fully meets, everything is in place, it meets the requirements, it's demonstrably implemented, it's regularly reviewed, it's meeting that goal of avoiding and reducing adverse impacts of waste disposal and increasing the quantity of waste diverted from disposal. And if not, there are plans in place to improve that system. So finally here, just some examples of what partially meets looks like. Let's say, for instance, the policy doesn't include hazardous waste. So there's a policy and it covers waste, but it doesn't specifically cover hazardous waste, and there is hazardous waste at the facility. let's say there's a baseline waste stream identification and risk assessment, but it hasn't been reviewed or updated since there were new or changed operations, or it doesn't capture all of the waste streams or potential adverse impacts. That would be something that then it's meeting parts of the expectations, but it's not really implemented up in an up-to-date manner. And finally, here looking at the processes are not effective to reduce waste, or there's no remediation plan in place for when adverse impacts occur. Once again, I think you can see here the patterns that we're trying to pull. A fully meets has everything and it's being reviewed for effectiveness. A does not meet has the bare minimum or nothing at all. And then the partially meets is really everything else. Next slide. Great. Well, I am going to turn it back over to Luke now. I don't know if you want to pause for any questions. I know it's a lot of information and probably will start to make more sense as we dive into the criteria themselves. But I'm happy to either take questions now or we can wait until the end.
Any questions for Hilary from what you've just heard? Feel free to take yourself off mute and ask away if you have anything.
All right. Well, then I'll see you all again soon when we talk a little bit about tailings.
Great. Thank you very much, Hilary. So this is obviously, as I said here, just the highlights of the RRA. We will go in depth into some of the criterion later on, but just the idea of these next few slides is to give you an overview of what we've done. So they say we have 33 criteria. We have one criteria guide, and we've translated it into 5 languages. And again, we have um, uh, put the 33 different criteria into the 3 kind of buckets of environmental, social, and governance. Although we want to make very clear that obviously there is a lot of overlap between those 3 buckets. And one of the things that we have tried to do in this in 3.0 is to highlight the overlap between the criteria, which I think there was some suggestion that in 2.0 some of the criteria were slightly siloed when in fact there is a lot of overlap across E, S, and G. I think it's fair to say that there are 2 main frameworks that cut across all of the criteria in 3.0, and that's the UNGPs, obviously very specifically on the social and governance criteria, but also on the environmental, and the OECD 6-step due diligence requirements. And so those are the kind of 2 major frameworks, although there are obviously others that we relied on as we revised the RRA. As you heard from me earlier, one of the key things that we tried to do in the revision of the RRA was increase clarity. And in doing that, we felt that a total kind of restructuring of the RRA was required. As you will have just heard from Hilary, there is a structure that is followed essentially in all 33 of the criteria that goes commitment, and in some cases that's a very obvious commitment. So just to take an example, in biodiversity, we require participants to have a commitment to no net loss. That's kind of upfront in the criterion itself, and then the practice. So what is expected in order to in terms of defining the practices themselves, the management effort. So as it says here, what resources, capabilities, procedures are required in order to deliver on those practices. The remediation, if applicable. So what is expected if the site is responsible for adverse impacts, and then the reporting. So there is, as Hilary mentioned, a sustainability reporting criterion, but each individual criterion may have separate reporting requirements as well. So those 5 steps are repeated across all of the criterion. This slide here simply shows how the criterion fall into the different buckets. Nothing, I think, particularly unusual here, just to say that the social bucket is bigger than the others, with a strong focus on labor rights and as I mentioned earlier, the UNGPs are very prominent across the social bucket in particular. So this slide here just shows the applicability of the 33 criteria to standalone or mining and co-located metal processing. And you know, because the mining and co-located metal processing, all of the criterion are applicable. If we move to the next slide here, you will see that standalone metal processing, downstream processing, manufacturing, and recycling, not all of the criterion are in fact applicable. So obviously, if you're a smelter or a downstream processor, for instance, mine closure is not applicable to you, and so they will be kind of removed from the assessment. Although there may be cases, potentially where it is applicable, and of course, in those cases, that will be expected to be added back in again. So we'll just go into a more of a deep dive onto the individual criterion. Again, as I said earlier, please do stop me if you would like to hear more, or you have any questions about particular criterion, and we will go on and take those questions. This is important. So obviously, the slide deck that I'm about to present does not show every difference between 2.0 and 3.0. What I've tried to do is pull out the major differences. And as it says here, assessors need to refer to the guide to implement 3.0 and not rely on this deck. But hopefully this deck should provide you with the kind of the major highlights. So we start with the governance criteria, and the governance criteria are kind of the really big cross-cutting criteria, and they are the ones that perhaps have received some of the most amount of input during the consultations. A lot of changes from 2.0, and they, when I say cross-cutting, they underpin, and they're both separate individual criteria, but also are embedded in each of the other criteria. For instance, management systems, risk assessments, so on. So I mean, I'm not going to read out every line on this slide, but what you can see here is that it basically provides the structure. The governance criteria provide the structure for the implementation of all the other criteria. In revising the 2.0, particularly on the governance side, we looked at 4 frameworks in particular. These are the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, the OECD Due Diligence Guidance, and ISO 14001 and 45001. And we will talk about those two ISOs in particular later on, because there are big changes is in terms of uh, how the copper mark is looking at those. Hilary, I don't know whether there was anything that you wanted to come on to before I move on. Anything you want to add on the governance criteria?
Yeah, maybe just to give an example or two of what we're talking about when we say they're sort of the foundation, but also cross-cutting through each of the systems. So an example I like to use is the risk assessment. And you'll see there's a requirement to do a risk assessment basically of all of the ESG issues that we see here. So you can identify within the site, within a participant, what are the biggest risks? And so that might mean that at some sites, right, it's water and then pollution and then community, whereas others are going to have a different set of risk profiles. And they might have overarchingly, again, looking at all ESG risks, number one, they have legal compliance and then greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera. But you'll also see within each of the criteria, there's an expectation to do a risk assessment. So the governance things look at the organization more comprehensively and as a whole at all of your ESG issues, whereas within each, you'll also see, for instance, within water, you have to understand what are the different risks within water, or what are the different risks within stakeholder engagement or community relationships that you need to understand. So in that respect, we're saying it's the foundation, but it's also cross-cutting in each. Similarly, just to give another example, is going to be the idea of a grievance mechanism. And you'll see that there is this one criteria um, uh, that will say grievance mechanism. And that means that all of your grievance mechanisms, whether you have one or three, are going to need to align with the UN guiding principles, and in particular, Principle 31 on the effectiveness criteria. But it also, you will see throughout the criteria that there's an expectation for access to a grievance mechanism. And so it's all very interconnected, because that grievance mechanism is not necessarily different from this big grievance mechanism criterion that we're talking about, and it's going to refer back. So hopefully that just adds a little bit of color as to how this was all designed and meant to work together, and that it's not duplicative in the sense that we're not saying you need to have a grievance mechanism for each of the criteria, but your grievance mechanism needs to cover all of the criteria. Go ahead, Luke.
Thanks, Hilary. That's super helpful. So there are, as I mentioned earlier, not every single criterion has been significantly changed. There are lots that remain, frankly, quite similar. And in the ones where there are minor changes, you will see that many of them revolve around two particular aspects. One is remediation. So that's a specific requirement across the criteria, and the other is around public disclosure. So you will see as I go through this presentation that many of the minor changes fall into those two camps. In terms of legal business integrity, I think it's pretty much stayed the same. Legal compliance, we have now requiring the implementation of a whistleblower hotline. That was not an explicit requirement in 2.0. And then in mine closure and reclamation, it's really around disclosure of performance is the main change there. Management systems is certainly one that is a big change from 2.0, and as you heard from Hilary just then, it really tries to be extremely interconnected. across all of the following criterion. And the big change, I guess, from 2.0 right now is how we see ISOs, the ISO 45001 and 14001 in RRA 2.0. They are, if you have those, then it meets the criterion on environmental management systems, and it meets the criterion on OHS. And for in 3.0, those are still required, but they are not sufficient. And we'll go into kind of why we have come to that decision in the next slide. But as has already been said, so we are expecting one set of holistic ESG management systems, recognizing that while the RRA is a site level standard, these environmental management systems may be at the corporate level, and it may not be just one system. It may be a number of standalone systems, but those standalone systems need to be kind of talking to each other because of this inherent interconnectedness of the criterion that we are talking about in this standard. And that management system has to be UNGP based. So the kind of running theme through all the criterion is identification, prevention, mitigation, and remediation. So yes, as I said, the 14,001 and 45,001 are no longer the only things required in order to meet management systems. And you'll see here the kind of four major reasons why that is the case. Remediation being a significant one. The focus on individuals and vulnerable individuals and groups that we felt was important that the ISO standards do not focus on, and the risk assessment kind of structure that we have landed on, in which it's risks to the important thing is risk to human rights and to environment. It's not a risk to business issue, and that is something that the ISO management systems do not address.
Yeah, if I can just jump in too, Luke. I think there's in addition to all this, just two main points to note. One is in this specific criterion, again, what we're looking at is the more holistic approach to management systems for ESG. And so that means a responsible person who's able to look at this comprehensively within the company.
We just lost you for a second there, Hilary.
That are covered within the rest of this RRA. The second
Hilary,
thing to note.
sorry, Hilary, just to jump in, we
Yeah.
lost you for about 10 seconds there. If you
Oh,
could repeat.
weird. Yeah, sure. So I was just saying this is looking, holistically at all of the environmental, social, and governance issues. So for instance, there should be a policy, a responsible person or persons. In a lot of companies, this is something like a committee, interdisciplinary, that looks at all of these issues. So first and foremost, this is again just going to be looking really broadly at all of the different ESG approaches within the facility. And so that's you'll also notice then that there is no longer a criteria for environmental risk management nor for human rights, because they are expected to be part of how all of environment is managed and all of the social aspects are managed, right? So those criteria don't exist. They've been consolidated into this one, and you'll see them flow through all of the different criteria within those different buckets. But the other thing, again, just to say, is when we're looking more holistically from the management system sense, this is the one that's looking at all three of those buckets together. So environment, social, and governance. And I think that that's important because it flows in really nicely then to the next criterion, number 2.
Thank you. So, as it says here, the risk assessment criterion, I don't think will be kind of that new to most participants. I think every site has a risk register, but what we are concerned about is the lens that they look at risks through on that risk register. So they are again, we're happy with looking at probability versus severity. That is an appropriate way to look at risk, we think. But it's what we're concerned about is risk to human rights and to the environment. So what we're asking is that sites carry out a scoping exercise to try and understand what are all the risks out there, and then to prioritize those risks based on impact. And impact again is about impact on human rights and the environment, and not impact on the business. So this is like with the management systems criterion, this is a standalone criterion that goes across all of the other that requires a kind of 30,000-foot view of risks across the site, but it also is embedded within each individual criterion in the sense that we are requiring the site to also have a specific risk assessment on, for instance, water or biodiversity, and to follow the same structure of this criterion across each of the individual criterion. Risk assessment is a core requirement in each of the individual criterion. Responsible supply chains is another criterion with significant changes. Less so on part 2, which is the kind of the old due diligence and mineral supply chain norm, but in part 1 of 3.0, which, as it says here, is grounded in the OECD responsible business conduct. It requires due diligence on all suppliers and all ESG risks, which we recognize is quite a significant enlargement from RRA 2.0. And as it says also here, requires risk prevention and mitigation plans, a remedy, and outlines requirements for responsible disengagement. So we do understand that is a significant change, and what we need to highlight here is in particular on part 1 that the change from significant suppliers to all suppliers, with prioritization based on circumstances of the business, and the due diligence is conducted on all risks, including environmental risks, which is the kind of the big change to highlight. But again, prioritization is kind of the name of the game here, and that prioritization should be in line with the risk assessment criterion in terms of severity and likelihood. In terms of remedy, that is an explicit requirement, but as it says here, remedy does not necessarily mean financial compensation, and that there are other forms of remedy available and possible. In terms of part two of this criterion, which is the kind of the CARA aspect, the due diligence on mineral supply chains aspect, it is very much dependent on where the site is in the supply chain. So mine smelters and refiners are required to implement the separate joint due diligence standard for copper, lead, molybdenum, nickel, and zinc, or equivalent. But fabricators and other downstream manufacturers not required to implement the JDDS. And we have external guidance on how they might embed mineral supply chain due diligence available for them. Before I move on to social criteria, any questions from what you've just heard?
Just to clarify, there will no longer be any full equivalency with the ICOs, only partial. Is that correct? For any of the criteria?
So the answer to that is that they are required, but they are not sufficient. So
okay, thanks.
they are, yeah.
Well, they're not required. It has to be ISO or equivalent, but yes.
Sorry, yes. As I think I'm right in saying is the case before, Hilary. So social criteria, criteria 11 to 25, and they are principally grounded in the UNGPs, the ILO Fundamental Conventions, and the voluntary principles. And you'll see we've gone into we've added some criteria here from 2.0, and we've also added, I think it's fair to say, some more detail in terms of the criteria that we previously had. I think I said at the beginning that in many of the criteria that have minor changes, many of those minor changes are related to remediation, and that is the case with child labor, in this case, no child labor, and freedom of association and collective bargaining. On non-discrimination and harassment, we've simply provided a little bit more detail on what we mean by that when we say non-discrimination and harassment. Community health and safety, that's really around disclosure, the changes there. Security and human rights, again, remediation and disclosure. Land acquisition and resettlement, disclosure, cultural heritage, disclosure. So disclosure and remediation is the kind of ongoing running themes in those social criteria where we've just made relatively small tweaks to the current 2.0 requirements. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a completely new criterion from 2.0, and I think this is where kind of the world has moved on substantially since 2019, and diversity, equity, and inclusion is now really considered a norm at most businesses, and I think this idea of respect, which obviously runs through the UNGPs, is a core aspect here, and respecting the diversity of workers, a culture of inclusivity and respect for fundamental rights and dignity, and equity for all persons in the workplace. So what we're really asking is that sites take a look and they try and identify gaps and needs based on the requirements outlined in this criterion, and then they think about whether they're able to make reasonable adjustments to fill those gaps and needs. And this is kind of, as it says, the positive counterpart to the non-discrimination and harassment criterion. You know, that criterion is about what not to do, and this is about, you know, what you can do to make employees' lives, you know, to help them feel respected, and to help them feel that they can bring their full selves to the workplace. In terms of employment terms, there's these are requirements that were mostly in the norms on working hours and remuneration. We've sort of coupled those two together within employment terms, and expanded the detail there. We previously had separate guidance on working hours, as that was an area that some sites had questions about based on RRA 2.0. We've incorporated that guidance now into 3.0. And I suspect that for most sites, this will be relatively easy to implement, and maybe with some exceptions around working hours where there's still some concerns around overtime and so on. But one area that I would like to pull out from this is determination of the living wage. So we put quite a lot of thought into this as to whether it should be a requirement, and we decided that we believe that it should. So we are asking sites to determine the living wage, and to assess whether there is a gap between the living wage in the site's region or country, and if there is a gap between the minimum paid wage and the living wage, to develop a plan towards ensuring that all workers receive at least the living wage. I suspect we will get some questions around how to calculate, how to determine the living wage, but there are a number of tools out there which are mentioned in the guide itself, which provide guidance as to how to do that. Occupational health and safety. We've now said a number of times that ISO 45001 is not sufficient to meet this criterion, but sites are nonetheless required to implement it, or a functionally equivalent kind of framework. In addition to that, sites are required to establish a baseline, to participate in remedy, and to disclose impacts. As we've now said a couple of times, remedy and impact disclosure are two things that throughout this RRA 3.0 we have included as requirements that are potentially significant changes, at least when coupled with others, as compared to 2.0. Emergency preparedness is a criterion that is entirely new, and draws in kind of strands from 2.0 criterion like tailings management, OHS, and community health and safety. And we just simply believe that this was a gap in 2.0 that needed filling, and so we have created this new criterion. As it says here, it's the same structure as most of the other criterion, the identify, implement action plan, implement a management system, remediate adverse impacts, and publicly disclose. And moving on to the environmental criteria. So I think the big thing to say here is the alignment with the Paris Agreement, and the quite close alignment with mitigation hierarchy where that's applicable. But also we've looked at the GHG protocol and the global industry standard on tailings management as kind of the four underpinning frameworks for all of the environmental criteria. The big one is climate action. So we had a lot of discussion here, both the COPMARC and RMI, around climate action and greenhouse gas emissions, and whether they should be separate or whether they should be one criterion. And obviously we have decided to have them separate. And in fact, we were asked this question many times during the public consultations, as to why we have separated them. And I think to me, the big reason for having them separate is that if we combine the two, then the climate mitigation aspect of climate action would almost undoubtedly get kind of all the limelight, all the would be highlighted, and the adaptation aspect would fall by the wayside. Because when people think about climate action, they immediately tend to think about greenhouse gas emission reductions, which is, of course, extremely important. But the adaptation aspect, we believe, is also critical. And by having a standalone criterion on climate action, we can pull together those threads of the different criterion that are out there. Climate action at one stage was in the governance section because it is so embedded in the other criterion. Not every single criterion, but many of them. And we took the decision to remove it from the governance section and put it in the environmental section. But we do believe that climate action as a concept is, and particularly the adaptation aspect, is deeply embedded in everything from water to biodiversity to emergency preparedness. It's really a kind of very cross-cutting criterion. And so what does that mean in practice? So a comprehensive integrated climate change mitigation and adaptation strategy and plan. Again, following the same structure of all the other criterion, but it's something that we believe needs to be implemented at a high level, that looks across, as I say, the other criterion. So this criterion is in many ways pulling on the threads of other criterion out there. The greenhouse gas emissions reduction criterion is kind of the most obvious and prominent, but the criterion on circular economy, on biodiversity and productive land, water stewardship, tailings management, biodiversity, again, and pollution are all areas in which kind of feed into the climate action criterion. Carbon offsets was something that got spoken about quite a lot in the public consultation that we held. Some of our stakeholders believed that carbon offsets were kind of not appropriate. We believe that they are an acceptable mitigation measure for greenhouse gas emissions that can't be avoided. But it shouldn't be the first thing or even the second thing that sites go to in order to avoid or reduce their emissions. That should be kind of the last option open to them. So this is potentially the biggest change from 3.0 from 2.0 to 3.0 is the criterion on GHG emissions reductions. So the big thing here is that we're including scope 3 GHG emissions in this requirement, and we've specifically pulled out the engagement with key stakeholders and the requirement to calculate and disclose site level carbon emissions data. We received a huge amount of feedback. This was the criterion that we received the most amount of feedback on across the 2 public consultations that we held. And I think, most of the pushback that we received was around scope 3 emissions, the requirement to disclose scope 3 emissions. And what we have been very upfront to our participants about on this is that we recognize their concerns, and we recognize that there isn't a credible framework for the calculation and disclosure of scope 3 emissions right now, and that some sites may not have all the data that they want, or the data may be incomplete. But we are looking for kind of good faith efforts, and that they need to be kind of transparent about how they've gone about calculating their scope 3 emissions, and as it says here, the assumptions they have used. And one of the kind of major issues that we faced when revising RRA 2.0 was to create a standard that worked for right now, worked for 1st of January 2024, but also would still be appropriate in 3 or 4 years' time. And this is, I think it's fair to say, an area where we have stretched. This will be a stretch for a number of our participants, but we believe that in the short to medium term, scope 3 emission calculation and disclosure will be increasingly a norm, and that there will be frameworks that will help sites to calculate and disclose their emissions emerging in the near future. And so this is where we've tried to ensure that our participants are, if not ahead of the trend, then certainly very much on the trend. We are very clear about the fact that the goals need to be aligned with the Paris Agreement, and that the targets that sites are required to develop should be science-based. Some of you may be aware that in initial drafts, first drafts, we spoke about the targets needing to be to use the Science-Based Target Initiative. That's no longer a requirement, but sites may do so if they find that useful. And what we mean by science-based is that they are in line with latest climate science that is deemed necessary to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. In terms of water stewardship, this it sort of essentially requires more detail. So we've included seabed and marine environments in there where applicable. We have required the explicit, this may be happening already, but we are explicitly requiring the implementation of the mitigation hierarchy as it concerns to water. We have targets for reductions in water consumption, water quality, water efficiency, and for water-related stewardship performance more generally. And again, the old issues of remediation and public disclosure coming back here, where they were not in RRA 2.0. I think what we are saying really with these new requirements is that sites will need to look at their management systems as it comes to water management, and just check that they've met all the new details that we currently have. I think in many cases our participants will be meeting these already, but they will just need to go through and ensure that they've met them. This is a entirely new criterion, a circular economy. We believe here at the Coppermark that circular economy is going to be one of the more critical issues for the mining and metals industry in the short to medium term, and we believe it important to highlight that in RRA 3.0. That being said, this was one of the harder criterion to write, because essentially each site is so unique, and so it's very difficult to come up with requirements around circular economy for a kind of broad range of sites in geographically diverse different metals, so on. But what we have included in here is that sites assess the circularity of their materials and create credible targets, that they have a management system for circular economy, that system is implemented both at the site's operations, but also manages the collection and recycling of materials at end of life. We try to avoid encouraged requirements, which kind of is a contradiction in terms, I understand, but we have included this encouraged, I guess, expectation probably is a better word, around monitor market expectations and regulatory requirements regarding supply chain due diligence on scrap. And we have asked sites to consider implementing supply chain due diligence on scrap. So we recognize that sites, our participants, the industry in general, is not at a place right now in order to do that as a requirement. But we, by including that, are signposting that we believe that this is an area that is likely to become more prominent in the future. We are asking sites to review the effectiveness of their potentially new management systems on circular economy, and then to publicly disclose information on how they're performing. We had some questions around life cycle assessments. In an earlier draft of RRA 3.0, we had a requirement around life cycle assessments. That is not a requirement anymore, but we do believe that LCAs are helpful to assess kind of the adverse impacts of material production, and so they are explicitly referenced in the standard. As it says here, and as I kind of alluded to earlier, because of the unique context of each site, many of the kind of sub-requirements within this particular criterion start with words like where applicable and where possible. And so, that is, there may be some sites that for where a lot is not possible and a lot is not applicable. And that will be something that we will keep an eye on. On this, I think I'm going to hand back to Hilary because she had more input on this change in the tailings criterion, and she has been following this from the beginning.
Sure. Well, I think it's probably not too much of a surprise that we have adopted into the standard itself our interim guidance on tailings management, which essentially requires all of our mining sites to implement the global industry standard for tailings management or equivalent, and also has been updated to include specific guidance for things like river and lake and ocean tailing systems. Currently, it is worth noting that the only equivalent system is the TSM, towards Sustainable Mining Tailings Management Protocol, and if all protocols and guidance of that system are implemented. So the big change from the old guidance to the current guidance is that new sites operating river and tailings disposal systems are not able to receive the copper mark. And that is a site that is starting to operate river and tailings disposal system after January 1st of 2024. Next slide. What I think is really important, both for those of you who are participants, but even more so for the assessors on the line, is how this is actually done within the copper mark framework, right? This is not our standard. It's a standard that we've adopted, similar to other systems like the UN Voluntary Principles on Business and Security and Human Rights, or others. So what we have here is that, for instance, participants using TSM and their tailings management protocol have to adhere to their requirements. And that is how conformance will be determined. So TSM has their own set of requirements, their own expectations for approved validators. And so that has to really go through that process. For all others, the copper mark assessors are not assessing the full implementation of the GISTM, but will use this chart and their milestones and activities that you see on the screen here in order to conduct a verification of the activities that have already happened. So if you break this into 3 activities, they are the self-assessment, the public disclosure, and then a third-party validation of implementation of the GISTM. For those who maybe are not as familiar, there are 2 deadlines that the Copper Mark and ICMM members are adhering to, and those were originally August of 2023, and that's for any consequence classification of extreme or very high. And for all others, it's August of 2025. So what we have done then is we've put in these deadlines for our assessors, so for Copper Mark auditors, to do an administrative verification of that self-assessment, making sure that it's complete, ensuring that all applicable criteria are self-assessed as meets, and that it's done within that timeline. Now, we've extended that review to be to the end of this year, similarly for the public disclosure. At the same time, you have your self-assessment and public disclosure for all others, again, which are due in August of 2025. The verification by our auditors must be done by the end of that year. So there's an additional 4 months there that can be completed. We do provide significant guidance into what exactly we're asking our assessors to look at during that verification of the self-assessment. And we'll be putting out more guidance that just clarifies sort of the expectations based on the level of independence of what's already been done. And then finally, there is an expectation for the third-party validation of implementation by a qualified expert. We recognize that not all of our assessors are going to be those engineering experts, and so this should be done by those qualified individuals. But once again, we do recommend here that, or require, excuse me, that our auditors look at that validation to make sure it's happened, and that's to be done as soon as reasonably practicable. Next slide. This is just a special note for that we are aware of a number of members of the International Council on Mining and Metals have been using another terminology that we don't actually have within the copper mark, and that is meets with a plan. And so what we have required for all of our assessors that are doing this revision, that are looking at this, I'm sorry, that was my Spanish coming out, that are doing this review of the self-assessment, wherever there is a meets with a plan, that does need to basically be translated into copper mark terminology of fully meet or partially meets, and that exception still applies for 4.7 and 5.7 of GISTM, which are very specific to engineering requirements. And so this is, again, something we can discuss offline, but just a note for those who are using this terminology that it does need to be reviewed by the copper mark assessors. Next slide. I think that might be it. Yep.
Great. Thank you very much, Hilary. That's very helpful. As you can see, there's some very concrete assessor, new assessor requirements in that tailings criterion. So coming here now to the last criterion 33, pollution. So this adds a little bit more detail on what's currently in RIA 2.0 to include noise, light, and visual pollution in the scope of the criterion, explicit requirement to establish a baseline and to publicly disclose the public disclosure requirement as well. So one of the things that we have said around baselines is if it's baselines are difficult things to not always easy to come up with at the start of operations. They sometimes don't exist, where if there hasn't been baseline sampling at the start of operations, sites should look at historical or synthetic data to establish an approximate baseline. But if those aren't available either, then the baseline may be taken from the time of the assessment. Ideally, all operations would have a baseline right at the beginning, but in reality, that's not always the case. So that's something that we have we've pulled it out here on the pollution criterion, but that goes for all the other criterion as well.